Good evening. It's good to be with you all today, and thank you for having us. As Pastor as Pastor said, we're missionaries in the country of Mexico. Does it matter where I put it? Nope. All right. Can you hear me? Maybe I'll move it up a little bit more. Yeah, it's good. All right. Well, as Pastor said, we're missionaries in the country of Mexico. My name's Adam. This is my beautiful wife, Karen. And we have a little girl, Olivia, who's in the nursery. And we have been in Mexico as missionaries since 2021. We're back in the States on furlough, traveling around, trying to raise a little bit more support. For sake of time, I'm just going to kind of share with you my testimony, then I'll get into the message. I'll try not to be too late today. But I grew up on the other side of Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. My entire life, I was born and raised in a Christian home. At the age of 4 years old, I gave my life to Christ. I asked Jesus to save me, and I remember coming home one Sunday evening. I didn't know everything that went into being saved as far as doctrinally, but I just came home one Sunday evening. I told my dad, Dad, my Sunday school teacher's telling me that if I don't ask Jesus to save me, I'm not going to go to heaven. And I didn't know anything else other than that, but I knew I wanted to go to heaven. And I told my dad, and he took me, and we knelt beside his bed, and I prayed as a 4-year-old boy and asked Christ to save me. Then growing up in our church, we always had a missions emphasis throughout the year, missionaries coming through, and at the age of 12 years old, I surrendered to be a missionary. And at that time, I had plans of going to a different country. I never thought about going to Mexico, but at least in the small town where I grew up, on the other side of Pittsburgh, there was no Hispanic culture. I thought Taco Bell was Mexican food. So that was about my cultural experience. And so it never once crossed my mind that I'd end up in Mexico. But I was able to go to Mexico for the first time as a single missionary in 2019. And there on my second survey trip to Mexico in March of 2020, I was able to meet my wife for the first time, and we eventually got married in July of 2021, and been working with her uncle, who's a national pastor there in Mexico for the last 3-4 years. Her family was reached through a Baptist missionary that went to Mexico back in the early 90s. And now, because of a missionary that chose to obey the Lord and go to Mexico, in the church that her uncle started, actually this past Sunday they celebrated 21 years of the church. But in that church, there's now 4 generations of Christians, including my wife and now our daughter, who attend the church there. And we're all reached for the gospel because of one missionary that chose to go to Mexico, and he reached her uncle. But I'd like to share with you a message today. As I said, I'll try not to go too long. I would like to start off first and foremost and thank you all for having us here. Again, I didn't know I'd end up here at this church. I was calling around the different churches in the New Jersey area. First, I think I got a hold of Brother Flynn, and then I told Brother Zeron that I was going to be at Brother Flynn's church. So he's like, hey, let me make some phone calls. So he called Brother Travis, and he set us up here. But I didn't know until I got here on Saturday that it was a missions emphasis. So it just worked out great. But thank you all for having us. I know this is the first time we met. We've been here since Saturday, though. And you guys have been very generous. Your pastor even hooked me up with a decent haircut across the street here. So I felt spoiled. I told my wife I came back as a new man. They put the towel on me, on my face and everything. Typically, I mean, it's not a hard job to cut my hair, but I typically just do it myself. But thank you. Thank you for your kindness and your generosity to us. I would like to just say on our back table, there's some prayer cards. We have a video presentation that we're not going to show for sake of time, but if you look on a prayer card, there's some links to our website where you can check out more about us and what we've been up to in Mexico. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, if you would. I'd like to share a simple, I can't even speak today, something like that, a simple thought today about the purpose and the plan of God for you. What is the purpose and plan of God for us? Proverbs chapter 19, we're going to read just one verse, and then we're going to turn over to Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. Proverbs 16:9 says here, a man's heart divideth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. Go with me, if you would, to Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. Romans 8:28 and verse 29, it says, And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Let's pray quickly and we'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this evening that you've given us. Thank you for the opportunity that I have and the privilege I have of sharing your word. I pray that you put me to one side and just speak through me. I pray that those who are listening, that are present here today, would open their hearts and their minds and be willing to hear from you in spite of who's speaking, as I said, but just say they would be willing to hear from your word, and that each one of us will leave here with a greater desire to serve you with our life. In your name I pray, amen. I'd like to share a thought, as I said, the purpose and the plan of God. Now, I know that typically we speak on that subject when we're talking to young people, but I've found as someone who's grown up in church my whole life that many times as we go through the different stages of life, the different paths that our lives may take us, we lose focus sometimes, right? And even sometimes we have our colloquialisms, if you want to say, or our sayings within Christianity that we kind of take things for granted. And I think many times we put everything under one umbrella and call it the will of God for our life. And the Bible does speak about the will of God. There's a perfect will of God for us. And the Bible does speak about that. But I think it's equally important for us to, when we're speaking on that idea, whether we're a new Christian, whether we've been in church for a while, maybe we've felt God's calling on our life at one time or another, it's important for us to distinguish inside the greater will of God for us between the purpose that God has for us and the plan that God has for us. The purpose that God has for each and every one of us is something that will never change. The purpose is unchangeable, but yet the plan, the way it plays out, changes for each one of us. And I'd like to kind of get into that as an introduction, and I just ask that you follow along. I believe it will make sense at the end. But the purpose that God has for us is something that never changes. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 15, if you would. Speaking on missions, as you all are focusing this month, missions, we have the what we call the Great Commission here in Mark chapter 16 and verse 15 as well. You can find the same idea conveyed in Matthew 28. But Mark 16:15, it's here where we find what's called the Great Commission. It says, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." It's a simple commandment that Jesus is giving to his to his disciples. Jesus is at the point of returning back into heaven. Jesus has been crucified. He's already risen from the dead, and now he's at the point of ascending back into heaven for one last time. And he's leaving one last commandment to the disciples. And he's saying, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Now, if you just look at it on the surface, it's a commandment that Jesus spoke directly to his disciples. It was a commandment that he was personally challenging his disciples to go and evangelize the word for Christ. But if you read further on in the scriptures, in the Gospels, or in the New Testament, we see how the first century church took hold of this commandment, and they as well went out and won their word for Christ. It would have never been possible, physically speaking, for only the 12 disciples to have done the job. It was a commandment that the whole church of that generation took hold of, and we see later on in the Apostle Paul writes that there was not a place known to man that had not heard the name of Christ. And they took control of that. Their purpose, our purpose as a Christian, doesn't change because we answer a call of God upon our life. Our purpose doesn't become all of a sudden appear because God's called us to preach or God's called us to be a missionary, whatever. Your purpose, the purpose for you all as First Baptist Church of Caldwell is the same as my purpose in Mexico. It's to win our word for Christ, to tell others about what Christ did for us on the cross. That's the greatest purpose that any one of us can have. But it's something that doesn't change. It doesn't change as you get older. It doesn't change as you go through different stages of life. It doesn't change by your location. It's something that is unchangeable. But yet, the plan that God has for us will change. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these verses just for sake of time. But Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, Paul's speaking here, and it says, "And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come in the unity of the faith of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Paul's speaking here, and he shares several different positions, if you would, within the church, roles that you may find within a church setting. And he's saying that some are called to be pastors, some are called to be apostles, some prophets, and etc. But all of them are for the same purpose. All of them, it says in verse 12. He mentions the list of them in verse 12 or verse 11. Then he says in 12, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. We may all have a different role within the church. Not everyone is called to be a pastor. I don't think that every Christian should be a pastor or should be a missionary. That's not the way that God designed it. But all of us serve the same purpose. We can go, not for sake of time, but we can go in Romans chapter 12 where we see that Paul says not to think more highly of yourself than you ought. Just because you have a different role within the church doesn't make you better than anybody else. The person that cleans the bathroom is no different than the person that leads the music or plays the piano or picks people up for church. It's no different. It's all the same purpose. Our purpose never changes, but yet the way it plays out is what changes. Now, and I've heard this saying, and I forget who said it exactly, but it says, our purpose of being how we live is more important than where we live. How we live is more important than where we live. We may have a different role. We may have a different location. God may move us around sometimes from place to place, but our purpose is always the same. And now why do I say that? Why do I think it's important to distinguish between those? Because I've found in my personal life, in my personal walk with God, that so many times, more often than not, we got so caught up in our day-to-day living. We get so caught up in the outward things, the plan that God has for us and how it plays out, because that's what everyone sees. That's what the church, that's what our friends and family at church see. They see, well, when we're serving in a position of leadership, when we're doing this or standing behind the pulpit or leading a Sunday school class, whatever, we get so caught up in the outward ways that God's will plays out for us, but we're not even doing on a day-to-day basis what we're fulfilling. We're not fulfilling our purpose on a day-to-day basis. And the whole point of this message is that let's get back to doing what we know we're supposed to be doing. Let's get back to fulfilling our purpose that God has for us and let God take care of the rest. There's too many frustrated Christians that go around miserable and frustrated in their walk with God because they're so caught up in when do I get to have the Sunday school class? When do I get to do this? When do I get to do that? But yet we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And again, this saying that I don't remember who said it first, but I've written it down, I've memorized it, is nothing good is accomplished by trying to rush the will of God. Nothing good is accomplished by trying to rush the will of God. I have a few points tonight, and we'll be done. But just quickly, a few points I'd like to share with you. The first one that I have is God reveals his plan one step at a time. God reveals his plan one step at a time. Psalm chapter 37, verse 23. Psalm chapter 37 and verse 23. Says here, if I can find it, there it is. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way. You know, one of the hardest things that I've had to learn, and I wouldn't say I'm a young man nor am I an old man. I'm 34 years old, and one of the hardest things, but most fruitful things that I've had to learn in my walk with God has been to wait on the Lord. I don't know anything more difficult than trying to wait on God's timing. And, you know, I remember when I went off to Bible college, I thought I had it all figured out. I was 18 years old. I went off to Bible college. And in my mind, as an 18-year-old, I thought I knew exactly how my life was going to play out. I knew since the age of 12 years old that I had surrendered my life to be a missionary. I had that in my future. I went to Bible college to study missions. And as an 18-year-old, I figured, well, I'm going to go off to Bible college. It's going to be about 4 years to finish Bible college. And during that time, I'm going to meet a beautiful young lady, and she's going to take one look at me and fall head over heels. It's going to be love at first sight, and she's going to say, you're just the one I've been waiting for my whole life, and we're going to get married after Bible college, and after that, we're going to go on deputation. At that time, deputation took about anywhere from 2 to 3 years, so that would be about 7, 8 years from the time that I was leaving high school. So I figured, well, by the time in about 7 to 8 years from now, I'm going to be in the ministry somewhere, serving the Lord with a family, with a wife, with a daughter. And you know how much of that happened in that time frame? 0. None of that happened. I went off to Bible college. I don't know, the girls were blind. They didn't know what was in front of them, and I don't know what was wrong with them, but I went to Bible college. I didn't find anyone. I was a single young man. All my friends are going off and getting married, going into the ministry, having families and having kids, and I'm there. I'm like, Lord, but when's it my turn? I know you? I don't doubt that you've called me. I know this is what you have for me. And it's not to be arrogant. That's just, I knew that that's what God had called me to do. And I was like, but God, when's it my turn? And one of the hardest things I had to learn was to learn to wait on God's timing. And nothing good is accomplished by trying to rush the will of God. Too many young people, friends of mine that went off to Bible college, that I've met in Bible college over the years, that have nothing to do with church anymore. They're out of the will of God because they got tired of waiting on God's timing. They got frustrated. They forgot that not everything happens on the timetable that we think is best, but God's will is always best. But God reveals his plan one step at a time. We see it in the life of Abraham. God told Abraham to leave Ur the Chaldees. He didn't tell him where he was going. He said, leave your family and follow me. And Abraham followed him. And because of his faithfulness, God made a great nation. Made the nation of Israel came out of the seed of Abraham because he chose to follow the Lord. And we know from reading the story that it wasn't something that came naturally for him. There was times that he struggled. There was times that he battled with his faith. But it's a decision that each one of us has to make, whether we're going to wait on the Lord or not. But God reveals his plan one step at a time. Then the second thing I have is whatever plans that you and I have other than doing what we're supposed to be doing right now is not of God. It's a long one, but I'll repeat it. Whatever plans that you and I have other than doing what we're supposed to be doing right now is not of God. What does that mean? How many times have we been in what we believe is the will of God? We think we're doing everything right. And we get there. We get where we've always dreamed about being. We feel like we're finally accomplishing something. And then as soon as we get there, we try to go to the next state. We try to make plans for, well, what's next? What's next? But many times we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we expect God to do his part. We're not fulfilling our purpose, our greater purpose of being faithful to his word, telling others about Christ, telling our neighbors, our loved ones about Christ, and we expect everything to work out. We expect everything to turn out how we want it to turn out. You know, as I said, I went all through Bible college. It was the year 2019. I was about 29 years old. I was just finally getting to where I felt that God had me to be, what God had called me to be. And again, as I shared at the beginning of a little bit of our testimony, I went to Mexico in 2021, and I went there with the purpose of getting married and then coming back right away to finish our deputation. I had done about 6 months of traveling around trying to raise support like what we're doing right now, and we had a little bit coming in about, we were really only at about 10% of our goal that we needed, but I got to Mexico and we got married, and I felt like, we were finally, I was finally getting to where God had me to go. I was like, as I said, I had learned, God had to teach me to wait on him, and I got to Mexico. I was like, well, that lesson's over. I can check that off my box. I can go to the next lesson that God has for me. And I learned how to wait on the Lord. I learned patience. I'm good. I don't need to learn it again. And we began filling out paperwork for my wife to come back to travel with me. She was born and raised in Mexico, and she didn't have any sort of visa to travel. So we began applying for the visa, and this was September roughly of 2021, and they sent an email back, and they said, congratulations, you have an appointment for your visa in March of 2023. So we ended up waiting 2 years there in Mexico. I'm like, but Lord, you already taught me that lesson. But I got it. I don't need to learn it again. But whatever plans that you and I have other than doing what we're supposed to be doing right now is not of God. And we had a choice to make. Are we going to trust the Lord, or are we just going to stay busy during this time? We couldn't leave the country without her visa, so we had a choice to make. Are we just going to be miserable for the next 2 years or so? Or are we just going to try to get our hands busy? Try to get busy in the work. And we didn't do everything perfectly, but we began working in the ministry, in her uncle's ministry. I began teaching Christian school, English in our Christian school. My wife was already a teacher there. But it's a decision that we all have to make. to learn to wait upon the Lord, to learn to wait on His timing. But nothing good is accomplished by trying to rush the will of God. And too many times we think we know what's best. We think we know when it's supposed to happen. But maybe God has something to teach us. Maybe we need to mature in our walk with God, but let's learn to wait on the Lord. Let's learn to get busy doing what we know we're supposed to be doing, and let God take care of the rest. The third point I have, going quickly, God is the one that orchestrates our life. God is the one that orchestrates our life. How many times God may be calling us to do something more. God maybe has something more for you to do here. Maybe you're new to the church and you're not sure what you can do. Maybe you can clean the bathrooms. Maybe you can welcome people when they come to the church. But maybe there's something more that God has for you. And so many times it's easy for us to say, no, I can't do that. I could never do that. I could never be a Sunday school teacher. I could never work on a bus route. I could never invite folks out to church. But God is the one that orchestrates our life. Like Moses said when God called Moses to lead the children of Israel. He made up every excuse in the world of why he's going to do it. But if God's called you to do something, He'll give you the capacity to do so. The next thing, number 4. A Christian must discover that serving God is a joy. We just read in the book of Psalms. Let's go to chapter 40, verse 8. A Christian must discover that serving God is a joy. The psalmist David, King David, says here in Psalm chapter 40 and verse 8, I delight to do thy will, O my God, yea, thy law is within my heart. If you read the story of David, you know it wasn't an easy life. It wasn't a life free of struggles. Many of his struggles were partially because of his own sin, but other ones, from the time he was anointed king of Israel, King Saul began persecuting him. King Saul actively sought after him, sent his men after him. King Saul personally threw his javelin at him, trying to kill him. But even through all of that, King David says, I delight to do thy will, O my God, yea, thy law is within my heart. There's too many Christians that it's always a woe is me mentality. It's always poor. Look how I'm suffering for Christ. And it's easy as a missionary to come through and be at one service in a church and put up a sad video, show some sad pictures of the poor people of the country where he's going and say, look how we're suffering for Christ. But I'm definitely not starving to death. I'm not struggling that much. And so there's not very many of us here in America that are truly suffering. Too many Christians have a woe is me mentality, but a Christian must discover that serving God is a joy. It's not to say that everything is easy. It's not to say that everything goes the way that we think it should go. But serving God is a joy. I know no greater peace or joy than knowing that it might not be the way I want it to be, but I know I'm doing what God has for me. I know that I'm doing what God, I'm trying to fulfill my purpose where God has placed me. But how do we expect anyone of the next generation to have any desire to serve the Lord, let alone sit in church, if all they see is miserable Christians? All they see is miserable Christians. No, we can't do that because what's pastor going to think? No, we can't do that because, the people at church are going to think bad about us. No, we get to go to church. We get to serve the Lord. It's a privilege to serve the Lord. It's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be the way that we want it to be. But it's a joy to serve the Lord. And I'll finish with this. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23. Lastly, man is incapable of planning his own life correctly. Man is incapable of planning his own life correctly. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23 says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in him that walketh to direct his steps. We're truly incapable of planning our own life. I had everything planned out, and I knew I had planned my whole life since 12 years old until I went off to Bible college. I was going to go to the country of Australia. When I surrendered my life to be a missionary at the age of 12 years old, I didn't think too far ahead. I just felt that that's what God wanted me to do, is to surrender my life to be a missionary and to serve Him whatever capacity He chose. But I remember that as soon as I made that decision, public and church, everyone started asking me, well, where are you going to go? What country are you going to go? And I didn't think that far ahead. So I had to think quickly, and I told everybody I was going to go to Australia. Now, in my 12-year-old mind, I'm thinking, well, I don't like school, so if I don't have to learn a new language, I don't want to learn a new language. So Australians speak English. I mean, their culture is not going to be that much different than ours. And kangaroos are cool. So that was my criteria as a 12-year-old boy of how to pick a mission field. I knew that God had called me, but I planned my whole life until from the age of 12 years old till 18 years old when I went off to Bible college that I was going to go to Australia. But truly, we're incapable of planning our own life correctly. We have our plans, but let's get back to focusing on doing our part, focusing on doing what we know we're supposed to be doing on a daily basis, and let God take care of the rest. Let God orchestrate our life on His timing. Let God orchestrate our life and guide us in whatever stage of life we may be. And I know this is typically a message that we give to young people, but I've found as I've gone throughout my short life, that as I've gone through several different stages of life, there's something that I constantly have to be reminded of. Constantly, no matter what stage of life it may be, focusing on doing what we know we're supposed to be doing and let God take care of the rest. That's the only way that we're ever going to know true peace. That's the only way we're ever going to have any chance of influencing the next generation is to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing and let God take care of the rest. Every head bowed, every eye closed. I'm going to ask Pastor to come and close out as he sees fit.